The attack came in the dark hours just before sunrise, at a time when the hunters were already gone. Samuel Granger swung down from his horse and walked slowly toward a small hut where he could hear children breathing softly in their sleep. He was a tall man, with a grey beard that fell to his chest, and he wore a long coat stained dark by swamp water. His boots made almost no sound on the wet earth. Behind him, 6 men spread out through the settlement like drifting shadows, each heading toward a different home. Granger had been watching this place for 2 weeks. He knew its routine well. Every few days, the adults left before dawn to hunt deer deep in the swamp or to gather healing plants along the riverbanks. They did not return until late afternoon. Only the children stayed behind, guarded by 3 elderly women and 1 old man who was too weak to walk very far. This morning, the settlement had no real defense. Granger pushed open the wooden door of the first hut. Inside, 3 girls slept on woven mats beside a fire that was slowly dying. The oldest looked to be about 12 years old. She wore a short cotton tunic decorated with tiny glass beads, the kind traded by Choctaw families who still held on to their old traditions. When Granger stepped inside, she woke suddenly and screamed. He bent down and seized her arm. She fought back, kicking and scratching wildly, but he was much stronger. He dragged her out into the thick fog. An elderly woman ran from another hut, shouting and reaching for the girl, but one of Granger's men shoved the woman hard to the ground. She fell heavily and did not rise again. All across the settlement the same horror played out. Doors were kicked open. Girls were pulled from their beds, their tunics torn, their beaded necklaces snapping and scattering into the dirt. They cried out for their mothers and fathers who were not there. They screamed in Choctaw, in English, and in the mixed language their people had formed over time. 2 of Granger's men forced a pair of young sisters toward a wooden wagon waiting at the edge of the clearing. The girls stumbled forward, their bare feet sliding in the mud. When they tried to stop, 1 man shoved them hard. Another man threw a 3rd girl into the back of the wagon, where she hit the boards and curled into herself, sobbing. The old man tried to stand in front of the wagon. He lifted his walking stick and shouted for the men to stop. One of Granger's riders struck him aside with his horse. The old man collapsed into the dirt, struggling for breath. The fog hung thick in the air. Smoke drifted up from cooking fires that still smoldered. The tension felt sharp, like lightning just before it strikes. Within 20 minutes, 10 girls were tied up and loaded into 2 wagons. Granger climbed onto the driver's seat, glanced back at the crying children, and snapped the reins. The wagons rolled south through the swamp, cutting deep tracks into the mud. Behind them, the 3 elderly women knelt in the clearing, holding one another and weeping. The old man lay on the ground, breathing in short gasps, staring at the place where the wagons had vanished. When the parents returned later that afternoon, they would find their daughters gone, and they would become something far more dangerous than hunters. They would become avengers. Before we continue with this shocking story of revenge, do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next videos. Thank you, and let us continue. The settlement had no name marked on any map. It existed in the narrow space between what white men claimed to own and what the swamp itself allowed them to control. 23 families lived there. Some were Choctaw people who had hidden when the government forced their nation west in 1831. Others were escaped slaves who had found freedom in the twisting waterways that fed into the Yazoo River. Over time, these 2 groups became one community, speaking a blend of Choctaw, English, and African languages that some elders still remembered. The settlement sat on a strip of higher ground surrounded by cypress swamp. The homes were simple, with walls of mud and woven cane, and roofs thatched with palmetto leaves. Smoke rose from cooking fires each morning. Children played near the water, catching crawfish and small fish. Women wove baskets and sewed clothes decorated with glass beads traded from free black communities in Yazoo City. Men hunted deer, trapped muskrat and beaver, and brought home wild turkey and duck. They survived by staying unseen. But being invisible only works when no one is watching. Samuel Granger had been watching for 3 weeks. He owned Black River Plantation in Holmes County, 40 miles south of the settlement. His land produced cotton, timber, and steady profit. Official records said he owned 43 slaves. In truth, fewer 20 of those people had legal bills of sale. The rest had been taken the way Granger took most things, through violence, lies, and the knowledge that in Mississippi, a white man's word was treated as law. Granger learned about the settlement from a trader named Lucas Prime, a man who moved through the Delta buying furs and selling ammunition. Prime had visited the hidden community twice, trading flour and salt for beaver pelts. He told Granger about the children. Plenty of young ones, Prime said while sitting in Granger's parlor and drinking whiskey. Mostly girls, 7, 8, 10 years old, healthy and strong. No one in Natchez would ask questions if you brought them in with the right papers. Granger understood exactly what Prime meant. In the Natchez slave market, children brought good money. A girl between 8 and 12 could sell for $200 to $300, depending on her health and looks. Boys were worth less unless they were old enough for hard field work. But girls could be sold as house servants, and buyers paid more for that. 10 girls could bring $3,000, maybe even more. Granger spent 2 weeks studying the settlement. He camped about a mile away, hidden in thick brush, and watched their daily habits. He saw the adults leave before dawn every few days to hunt deep in the swamp or gather plants along the riverbanks. Women collected roots, bark, and leaves for medicine and food. Men tracked deer and set traps for small animals. These trips lasted most of the day. When the adults were gone, only children remained, watched by a few elderly people too weak to travel far. Granger saw his chance. On the night of October 14, 1854, he gathered 6 men, overseers and slave catchers he had used before. He explained the plan clearly. "We go in before dawn," he said. "The adults will be gone. We take the girls, load them into the wagons, and we are back at Black River by afternoon. Fast and clean, no bodies. No trouble." One of the men, a thin Kentuckian named Howell, asked about the old people. "They will not fight," Granger replied. "And if they do, we deal with it." The men nodded. They had done this work before. They rode out at 3 in the morning, moving quietly through the swamp. The moon was nearly full, giving just enough light to follow the trail. Granger led the way. He knew every turn, every crossing, and every stretch of solid ground. By 4 o'clock they reached the edge of the settlement. The homes were dark. Cooking fires had burned down to glowing coals. A few dogs stirred but did not bark. Granger's men tossed strips of salted pork to the animals as they passed. Granger signaled, and the men spread out, each one heading to a chosen hut. They moved silently through the fog. Granger walked toward the largest hut, where he had earlier seen 3 girls sleeping. He opened the door slowly. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and cornbread. 3 girls lay on woven mats near the fire. The oldest appeared to be around 12. She wore a simple cotton tunic decorated with small blue and white beads along the neckline. Her hair was braided and tied with a strip of red cloth. Granger stepped inside, his boots scraping lightly on the dirt floor. The girl opened her eyes and stared at him in confusion. Then she understood and screamed. Granger rushed forward and grabbed her arm. She kicked and beat her fists against his chest. He dragged her toward the door. The 2 younger girls woke and began to cry, pressing themselves against the wall. Outside, the settlement exploded into chaos. An elderly woman ran from a nearby hut, shouting in Choctaw. She reached for the girl, trying to pull her free. One of Granger's men, a broad-shouldered overseer named Cobb, shoved teeth. He woman hard. She fell backward into the dirt and lay stunned. Around the clearing, men pulled girls from their homes. 2 sisters wearing short tunics with shell beads were forced toward the waiting wagon. They slipped in the mud, barefoot and shaking. When the older sister tried to stop, a man shoved her down, grabbed her hair, and dragged her the rest of the way. Another girl, no more than 8 years old, was thrown into the wagon bed. She hit the boards and curled up, crying. An old man came out of one hut, thin and bent, his white hair framing a deeply lined face. He held a wooden walking stick and stepped in front of the wagon, shouting for the men to stop. Howell rode forward and knocked him aside with his horse's shoulder. The old man fell into the dirt, gasping and clutching his ribs. One of the elderly women ran to him and knelt beside him, crying. Granger dragged the girl he had taken to the wagon and lifted her inside. She fought the whole way, scratching and biting. He struck her across the face and she went silent in shock. "Tie them," Granger ordered. Rough hemp rope was used to bind the girl's wrists. Some children were too frightened to fight. Others screamed and kicked until they were struck or threatened. Within 20 minutes, 10 girls sat in the 2 wagons, their hands bound, their faces streaked with tears. The youngest was 7, the oldest was 13. Granger climbed onto the driver's seat of the first wagon, ready to move. The wagon creaked as it moved. He glanced back at the settlement one last time. The elderly women stood in the open space, clutching one another, crying openly. The old man was still on the ground, his breath short and full of pain. A few small children, too young to be taken, stood in the doorways of the huts, watching quietly. Granger snapped the reins. The horses moved forward, dragging the wagons south through the swamp. Behind them, the fog closed in and swallowed the settlement whole. The trip to Black River Plantation lasted 6 hours. The wagons followed worn logging paths and old hunting trails, moving slowly through thick woods and across shallow creeks. For the first hour, the girls sat in silence, frozen by fear and shock. Then the youngest girl began to cry again, and soon others followed. Granger did not stop. He did not turn around. By mid-morning, the swamp gave way to open land. Cotton fields spread out in every direction, the white bolls ready to be picked. Far away, the main hoe, use of Black River Plantation, stood above the fields, a 2-story building of whitewashed wood, with a wide porch and tall windows. But the wagons did not head toward the main house. Instead, they turned onto a narrow road leading to the slave quarters, a line of small wooden cabins near the edge of the land. Past the cabins stood a larger structure, a storage barn used for tools and supplies. Beside it was a smaller building with no windows, only a thick wooden door secured with an iron lock. This was the quarantine shed. Granger used it to hold newly captured or bought slaves before forcing them into work on the plantation. It was a place meant for isolation, control, and breaking the spirit. The wagons stopped in front of the shed. Granger climbed down and unlocked the door. Inside, the space was dark and smelled of old wood and sweat. There were no beds, only a dirt floor scattered with straw. A single bucket sat in the corner. "Get them inside," Granger said. His men untied the GRLS and shoved them toward the shed. Some tried to run, but the men were quicker. They grabbed the children and forced them through the doorway. One girl tripped and scraped her knee on the threshold. She cried out, but no one helped her. When all 10 girls were inside, Granger shut the door and locked it. "They stay here until tomorrow," he said. "I'll ride to Natchez in the morning and find a buyer. They'll be sold by the end of the week." One of his men, Cobb, asked, "What if someone comes looking for them?" Granger smiled, his gray beard parting to show yellow teeth. "No one's coming. Those swamp people have no papers, no rights, nothing at all. They can't go to the law. They can't do anything." The men laughed. Inside the shed, the girls pressed close together in the dark. The oldest girl, the first one Granger had taken, wrapped her arms around the younger ones. She whispered to them in Choctaw, trying to soothe them, though her own body trembled. The hunters returned to the settle. It meant just after noon. There were 12 of them, 8 men and 4 women. They had left before sunrise to check traps along the river and hunt deer in the deeper swamp. It had been a successful morning. They carried 2 deer, a dozen muskrats, and bundles of wild greens and healing roots. They entered the clearing, talking and laughing, expecting children to run toward them. Instead, they found only silence. The elderly women sat near the central fire pit, holding each other and rocking slowly. The old man lay on a mat inside a hut, his breathing shallow, his face tight with pain. A few young children, too small to be taken, stood nearby, their eyes wide and empty. One hunter, Gideon Redpath, dropped the deer from his shoulders and ran forward. "What happened?" he shouted. An elderly woman looked up, tears running down her face. "White men," she said in Choctaw. "They came before sunrise. They took the girls." The ground seemed to fall away beneath Gideon's feet. "How many?" 10. His daughter was one of them. She was 11 years old. Her name was Mary. Another hunter, a woman named Naomi, fell to her knees. "Where did they go?" The old man spoke weakly from inside the hut. "South. They had wagons, 2 wagons. They went south." Gideon turned to the others. Their faces reflected what he felt inside. Grief, anger, and something deeper, a violence held back for far too long. "We go after them," Gideon said. No one argued. They moved fast. The women gathered food, dried fish, cornmeal, and strips of smoked venison. The men collected weapons, knives, hatchets, and a few old rifles hidden in the swamp for years. One man carried a pistol taken from a slave catcher 5 years earlier. Gideon knelt beside the wagon tracks in the mud at the edge of the settlement. He studied them closely. 2 wagons, both heavily loaded. The tracks were deep and clear. They have maybe 6 hours on us, Gideon said, but wagons move slow. We can catch them. Another hunter, Thomas Crow, pointed to marks on a nearby tree, fresh cuts from a hatchet. They're marking the trail. They've done this before, Gideon nodded. Then we follow the marks. By early afternoon, the 12 hunters set out. They moved quickly, following the wagon tracks south through the swamp. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The trail passed through Atala County, a land of thick pine woods and red clay hills. The hunters did not stop, following tracks and hatchet marks on trees. They crossed shallow streams, climbed ridges, and pushed through thorny brush that ripped at their clothes and skin. By nightfall, they had covered 20 miles. They did not camp. They kept walking, guided by moonlight. Gideon led, his eyes fixed on the ground. Behind him, the others moved quietly, their faces hard. Around midnight, they reached a small settlement of freed black people near the town of Kosciuszko. The people there knew Gideon. He had traded with them before. An old woman named Esther stepped out of cabin when she heard them coming. One look at their faces told her enough. "What do you need?" she asked. "Water," Gideon said. "And information. 2 wagons passed through here. White men. They had children." Esther nodded. "I saw them. This morning, just after dawn, they stopped at the creek to water their horses. I didn't see the children, but I heard crying." "Where were they headed?" Gideon asked. "South, toward Holmes County. There's a plantation near the big Black River Plantation. The owner's name is Granger. He's known for buying people without papers." Gideon's jaw tightened. "How far?" "Another 15 miles, maybe less." Esther gave them water and cornbread. They ate and drank quickly, then moved on. They reached the edge of Holmes County just before sunrise. The land flattened, wide cotton fields stretching between patches of forest. Smoke rose from chimneys in the distance, marking wealthy plantations. Gideon stopped on a low hill and looked down. He saw a large plantation, a white house, barns, and a row of slave cabins. Beyond them stood a small building with a locked door. "That's it," Thomas Crow said quietly. "That's where they're holding them." Gideon nodded. "We wait until dark. Then we move." The hunters hid among oak trees on the hillside. From there, they watched the plantation unseen. They saw enslaved people picking cotton under armed overseers. White men rode horses between the rows. They watched the locked shed near the cabins. They saw Samuel Granger, gray-bearded, walking from the main house toward the shed. Gideon watched him unlock the door and step inside. Moments later, children's cries carried through the air. Gideon closed his eyes and breathed slowly. "Tonight," he said, "we end this." As the sun went down, the plantation grew quiet. Field workers returned to their cabins, worn out from the heat. Overseers gathered near the main house, drinking and laughing. Granger sat on his porch, smoking and counting money. The hunters stayed hidden. Near midnight, 2 men slipped out from the slave quarters toward the trees. They had been sent by the others who had seen the hunters and understood. Their names were Elias and Jonah. Elias was in his 40s, tall, with scars across his back. Jonah was younger, strong, and sharp-eyed. Both had been taken against their will. Both had dreamed of escape and revenge. Gideon met them at the edge of the trees. "You know why we're here," he said. Elias nodded. "We saw the girls. They're in the shed. Granger plans to take them to Natchez in the morning. He's already contacted a buyer." "How many men?" Gideon asked. 6 overseers, plus Granger and his brother Edward, all armed. Gideon thought for a moment. "Can you reach the shed?" Jonah spoke quietly. "We can, but if we do this, we're not just freeing your daughters, we're freeing all 43 of us, and we won't leave anyone alive to hunt us down later." Gideon met his eyes. "You know what that means?" "I do, Joe." Nas said, "We've waited a long time for a reason to fight. You gave us one." They spent the next hour planning. The enslaved workers would start a distraction near the main house, setting fire to one of the barns. While the overseers rushed to stop it, the hunters would move toward the shed and free the girls. Together, they would seize the weapons from the overseers and put an end to Granger and his men. The plan was born from desperation and anger, but it was the only chance they had. Elias and Jonah made their way back to the slave quarters. The hunters waited in the dark, weapons in hand, barely breathing. At exactly 2 in the morning, fire burst from the hay barn near the main house. Flames climbed fast, and overseers shouted as they rushed toward it with buckets of water. Granger and his brother stormed out of the house, yelling orders into the confusion. In all the noise and panic, no one noticed the shadows slipping toward the locked shed. Gideon reached the shed first. He led a thick iron bar from his belt and forced it into the narrow gap between the door and the frame. Thomas Crow and 2 others hurried to help. Together they strained until the lock snapped free. Wood cracked loudly, and the door swung open. Inside, 10 girls stared at them. Their faces were thin, their eyes wide with fear and hope. "Mary," Gideon whispered. His daughter ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. One by one, the other girls rushed forward, crying as they found their parents. There was no time to stop. Heavy footsteps thundered across the dirt yard. Samuel Granger stepped into view. His gray beard was wild, his face twisted with rage. A Colt Navy revolver was clenched in his hand. "You goddamn," he began. Gideon moved first. He carried a short hunting spear, the kind used to finish wounded deer. He stepped in close and drove the blade into Granger's chest just beneath the ribs. Granger's eyes flew open. The revolver fell from his hand. He staggered backward, grabbing the spear shaft, then dropped to his knees as blood soaked his shirt. Gideon yanked the spear free and stepped away. Granger collapsed face first into the dirt and never moved again. An overseer named Cobb ran from the barn and froze when he saw Granger's body. He lifted his rifle. Elias appeared behind him without a sound and swung a wood-splitting axe in a wide arc. The blade struck Cobb on the side of the neck. He fell instantly, silent and still. Chaos spread across the plantation. The fire jumped from the barn to another building. Flames lit up the night, throwing long shadows across the fields. The remaining overseers ran in every direction, shouting and trying to organize, but it was already over. The enslaved workers poured out of their cabins, carrying axes, tools, and stolen weapons. Some had waited years for this moment. Others had waited their entire lives. They moved with purpose, blocking paths and cutting off escape. One overseer tried to reach the main house. John met him on the porch steps and drove a pitchfork through his stomach. The man screamed and collapsed. Another fired his rifle wildly into the dark, missing everything. A group of enslaved men tackled him and beat him with shovels and hoes until he stopped moving. Edward Granger, Samuel's brother, ran out the back of the house toward the stables, hoping to reach a horse. A woman named Ruth stepped into his path. She had worked in the kitchen for 15 years. A butcher knife gleamed in her hand. "Please," Edward said. Ruth did not answer. She stabbed him once in the chest and once in the throat. He fell against the stable door and slid down, blood pooling beneath him. By sunrise, every white man on the plantation was dead. The enslaved workers and hunters gathered in the yard as dawn broke. The fires burned low, leaving the barns as smoking ruins. The main house still stood, but no one cared. Gideon stood with the 10 girls, making sure each one found her parents. They cried and clue. Together, shaken but alive. Elias walked up to Gideon. "We can't stay," he said. "When word spreads, they'll come with dogs and guns. They'll hunt us." Gideon nodded. "Then we burn the rest." They moved fast. The main house was set ablaze. Flames swallowed the porch, the parlor, and the bedrooms where Samuel Granger had slept. They burned records, ledgers, bills of sale, and every paper that claimed ownership of human lives. Gates were opened and horses were released. Whips, chains, and iron collars were smashed and destroyed. By mid-morning, Black River Plantation was nothing but ash and memory. The group, now more than 50 people, headed north and west along the Big Black River toward Vicksburg. There were free black communities there, places where fugitives could hide and survive. As they walked, children began singing old songs taught by their grandmothers, songs of freedom and home. 3 days later, a neighbor rode past the ruins and alerted the sheriff of Holmes County. Tay men rode out and found bodies, burned buildings, and wagon tracks heading north. The sheriff wrote a report and called it a slave uprising. He said runaways killed Samuel Granger and destroyed his property, but he did not send men after them. He was afraid. Other plantation owners read the report and felt the same fear. If enslaved people could organize, fight back, kill white men, and burn plantations, what would stop it from happening again? Local newspapers printed short notices and avoided details. They did not want to inspire others. Within a week, the story vanished from print, but not from memory. In slave quarters across Mississippi, people whispered about Black River. They spoke of 10 girls taken and parents who came for them. They spoke of Gideon Redpath and the hunters who freed the land. In those whispers, the story became more than history. It became hope. The journey north lasted 6 days. 53 people moved through forests and swamps, avoiding roads and towns. They traveled at night and slept hidden during the day. Children limped with blistered feet, but no one complained. They knew stopping meant death. Gideon led, guided by skills taught by his grandfather. He read the land like a book, finding water, safe paths, and food. Behind him walked the 10 girls, close to their parents, barely speaking. Mary stayed near Gideon, gripping the back of his shirt as if afraid he might vanish. Elias and Jonah managed the group, helping the weak, sharing food and guarding water. Leadership had found them through necessity. On the second night, they crossed into Madison County. Hills rolled with pine and oak. Distant house lights flickered, but they stayed deep in shadow. Sarah carried her 3-year-old son on her back. She had lost her husband years earlier when he was sold away. When offered help, she shook her head. "I carried him into slavery," she said. "I'll carry him out." On the third day, they reached the Big Black River. The water was wide and slow beneath a gray sky. Thomas Crow found a shallow crossing. They crossed in small groups, holding hands. Children were carried. The water reached their waists and burned with cold. On the far side, they rested. A small fire was built and hidden with rocks. Cornmeal mush was shared among the children. Food was nearly gone. Gideon and Thomas scouted ahead, watching for riders. They saw none, but Gideon knew that meant little. "How far to Vicksburg?" Thomas asked. 3 days, maybe 4. Gideon said. "Will they help us?" "They have to," Gideon replied. "There's nowhere else." He carried the gunpowder with care. He knew a man in that area named Solomon Blake, a blacksmith who had purchased his freedom in 1840 and now owned a small forge close to the waterfront. Solomon was known for helping people escape, hiding runaways inside his workshop until they could slip onto a boat heading north or west. If they could reach Solomon, there was hope. But 3 days was a long stretch of time. Hen people were actively hunting you. On the 4th night, they passed through Warren County, staying near Bog Cheeto Creek. The water there was shallow and clear, and they moved west by walking through the creek bed to hide their tracks. By then the children were struggling badly, too tired to walk without tripping. One of the older men, a field worker named Isaac who was almost 60, collapsed near the creek bank. Jonah and another man lifted him and carried him for the next 2 miles until they found a spot to stop. Elias knelt beside Isaac and gave him water from a wooden canteen. The old man drank slowly, his hands trembling. "I'm slowing everyone down," Isaac said quietly. "You're coming with us," Elias replied. "We didn't leave Black River just to abandon people now." They rested for 2 hours and then moved again. The night was pitch dark, with the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. Rain started falling just after midnight, a cold drizzle that soaked their clothes and turned the ground slick. The children cried softly, and the adults wrapped them in whatever they had: ripped blankets, pieces of burlap sacks, strips of cotton torn from their own shirts. By dawn, they were within 10 miles of Vicksburg. Gideon sent Thomas ahead to find Solomon Blake and warn him they were coming. Thomas left at first light, moving quickly through the trees with a knife in his belt and a small pouch of dried venison in his pack. The rest of the group hid in a thick patch of cane and briars, a place safe enough to disappear during the day. They crowded together for warmth. The children pressed between the adults, everyone shaking in wet clothing. There was no fire, because smoke would expose them. Gideon sat beside Mary with his arm around her shoulders. She had barely spoken since they left Black River. Sometimes at night he heard her crying quietly, but when he asked if she was all right, she only nodded. He did not push her. There would be time for words later, if they survived. Long enough to be safe. Around midday, a younger man named Daniel climbed a tree to watch the road. He stayed there nearly an hour, scanning the distance. When he came down, his face was pale. "Riders," he said, "maybe a mile south, moving slow like they're searching for something." Gideon's jaw tightened. "How many? 6, maybe 7. Do they have dogs?" The group went silent. Dogs meant they could be tracked through water and thick brush. Dogs meant the hunters were serious. Elias stood and checked the rifle he had taken from one of the overseers at Black River. It was loaded, but he only had 4 shots left. Jonah carried a pistol with 2 bullets. Gideon had his spear and a knife. The others carried axes, hoes, and sharpened sticks. It was nowhere near enough to fight 7 armed white men. "We keep moving," Gideon said. "Staying here means dying here." They left the thicket and headed west, staying low and using every bit of cover the land offered. The rain had stopped, but ground was soft and their footprints showed clearly. Gideon knew the dogs would find their trail sooner or later. They had to reach Vicksburg before that happened. By late afternoon they reached the edge of town. In the distance they could see the river, wide and brown, with steamboats moored along the docks. Smoke rose from chimneys in the white part of town, and faint sounds of hammers and saws came from workshops near the waterfront. Thomas waited for them at the edge of a cotton field, hidden behind a broken wagon. He waved them over, his face tight with worry. "Solomon knows you're coming," Thomas said. "He's clearing space in his forge, but we need to move fast. There are slave catchers in town asking questions. Someone saw a large group moving through the countryside, and they're offering money for information." "How much time do we have?" Gideon asked. "Maybe an hour, maybe less." They moved quickly through the back streets of Vicksburg, avoiding main roads where white men gat. The freed black community lived in a cluster of small homes near the river, built on stilts to stay above floodwater. Solomon Blake's forge stood at the end of a narrow alley, a low brick building with a tin roof and a stone chimney. Solomon waited outside. He was broad-shouldered and in his 50s, his arms marked with scars from years of working hot iron. When he saw the group approach, 53 people filthy and exhausted, some limping, others carrying children, his eyes widened. "Jesus," he said softly, "how many did you bring?" "Everyone," Gideon said. "We brought everyone." Solomon studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Get them inside. Now." The forge had a wide workspace in front and 2 storage rooms in the back. Solomon and several other freed men from nearby helped move the group inside, filling every corner. The children sat on the floor, leaning against one another. The adults stood wherever they could. The air was hot and heavy with the smell of old smoke and sweat. Solomon shut the doors and barred them from inside. "You can't stay long," he said. "If the catchers find you here, they'll burn this place down with all of us in it." "We need a boat," Gideon said. "Anything heading north or west, anything that gets us out of Mississippi." Solomon shook his head. "Every boat on that river is watched. Captains report to the harbor master, and the harbor master reports to the sheriff. You try to board a steamboat, you'll be arrested before you're halfway up the plank. Then what do we do?" Solomon thought for a moment, then turned to a thin gray-haired man named Eli. "You still have that flatboat?" Eli nodded slowly. "It's old. Leaks some, but it floats. Where is it?" "Tied south of the docks near the sandbar." Solomon looked back at Gideon. "It's not much, but it's all we have. You take it tonight. Float downriver to the Louisiana side, then head inland. There are Choctaw communities in northern Louisiana that might help you. It's not safe. But it's better than staying here." Gideon nodded. "We'll take it." They waited inside the forge until nightfall. The heat grew worse as the hours passed, and some of the children fainted from exhaustion. The women fanned them with cloth and gave them water from a barrel in the corner. Outside, voices passed by, men laughing and talking. At one point someone pounded on the door and shouted, asking Solomon if he had seen any runaways. Solomon stepped outside and said he hadn't. The man accepted the answer and moved on. When full darkness came, Solomon led them out a back door that opened onto the riverbank. They moved in a long line, staying low near the water. The Mississippi stretched wide and black ahead, its surface rippling under moonlight. Lights from steamboats glowed the main docks, and beyond them stood the dark shapes of warehouses and cotton sheds. Eli's flatboat was tied to a willow tree a quarter-mile downstream. It was a rough vessel about 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, built from uneven planks sealed with tar. A single oar lay across the deck for steering. It was never meant to carry 53 people, but it had no choice. They boarded carefully, trying not to make sound. The boat sagged under the weight, and water seeped through the cracks. Some of the men used their shirts to plug the leaks, pressing cloth into the gaps. When everyone was aboard, Eli and Jonah pushed the boat away with long poles. The current grabbed it at once and pulled it toward the center of the river. The flatboat slowly turned and drifted south with the flow. Gideon stood at the front, watching the lights of Vicksburg fade behind them. Mary sat at his feet, her head resting against his leg. Around them, the others sat in silence, too tired to speak. They floated through the night, carried south and west by the river. No one knew exactly where they were headed. Louisiana was dangerous, another slave state with laws that turned people into property and property into money. But it was also vast, filled with swamps and forests, where people could vanish if they knew how to live. By dawn, they had traveled 15 miles. The river widened, and the land on both sides changed from farmland to dense forest. Gideon guided the boat toward the western bank, searching for a place to land. They found a narrow inlet surrounded by cypress trees and dragged the boat onto muddy ground. They were in Louisiana now, somewhere south of Lake Providence, in a stretch of land that belonged to no one and everyone. Elias stood on the shore and looked at the group. "We need to decide where to go next. We can't stay on the river. Too many boats, too many eyes. We need to head inland. There are Choctaw settlements west of here." Thomas nodded. "My grandmother came from one near Black River Lake. If we can find them, they might help us." "And if they don't?" someone asked. Thomas did not answer. Gideon looked at the group, the 53 people who had survived Black River Plantation, who had walked for 6 days and floated down the Mississippi on a leaking boat. They were exhausted, hungry, and desperate, but they were alive, and they were free. "We keep going," Gideon said. "We find the settlements, and if they won't take us in, we build something of our own." No one argued. They turned west and moved into the forests of northeastern Louisiana. The land was different here, wetter and thicker, with oak and gum trees rising out of dark water. They followed animal paths and dry ground, disappearing into the wilderness. They moved quietly along the ridges, staying away from open ground where they could be spotted. On the second day in Louisiana, they came across a creek with clean, clear water and stopped to drink, wash their faces, and clean their hands. The children played in the shallow stream, splashing and laughing, showing joy for the first time since the attack on Black River. The adults sat along the banks, cleaning their injuries, stitching ripped clothing, and trying to gather their strength. Sarah, the woman who had carried her young son on her back for miles, sat next to Gideon and stared into the trees. "Do you think we will ever truly be safe?" she asked. Gideon did not reply right away. He watched Mary kneeling near the water, her fingers drawing slow shapes in the soft mud. "I don't know," he said at last, "but I do know we are safer than before." Sarah nodded slowly. "That is enough for now." They traveled for 2 more days, going deeper and deeper into the wild land. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they noticed smoke rising from a clearing ahead. Gideon and Thomas moved forward with care, weapons in hand, expecting to see a white settlement or maybe a logging camp. Instead, they came upon a Choctaw village. It was small, with maybe 15 families, living in traditional homes made from woven cane wit. Thatched roofs, gardens surrounded the houses, full of corn, beans, and squash. Children played near a shared fire pit, while women worked at looms, weaving cloth from plant fibers. An elderly man stepped forward when he noticed Gideon and Thomas. He wore a long shirt decorated with shell beads and held a walking stick carved with symbols. He studied them closely for a long moment, then spoke in Choctaw. Thomas answered him in the same language. They spoke for several minutes before the old man nodded and motioned for them to bring the others forward. The group came out of the trees, 53 people in total, dirty, tired, carrying children and wounded elders. The Choctaw villagers watched them quietly. The old man spoke again, his voice calm yet strong. Thomas translated for the group. He said, "This land is for people who have nowhere else to go." He said, "You may stay." Relief moved through the group like a strong wave. Some of the women cried openly. Men who had not smiled in. Weeks smiled now, carefully, as if afraid the feeling would disappear. Solomon's words had been true. It was not completely safe, but it was far better than what they had left behind. In the weeks that followed, the group slowly began to rebuild their lives. The Choctaw villagers shared food and helped them construct shelters. They taught them which plants could be eaten safely, which roots worked as medicine, and how to move through the swamp without leaving signs behind. In return, the formerly enslaved people shared skills learned on plantations, such as blacksmithing, carpentry, weaving, and better farming methods. Gideon and Mary built a small home on the edge of the village near the creek where the water stayed clear. Each morning, Gideon woke before sunrise and walked through the trees, watching for danger. Each evening, he came back to find Mary sitting by the fire, weaving baskets from dried reeds just as the Choctaw women had shown her. One night, as they sat together quietly, Mary spoke for the first time about what happened in the shed at Black River. "I thought we were going to die," she said softly. "I thought we would never see you again." Gideon pulled her close. "I would have walked through hell to find you," he said, "and I would do it again." She nodded, resting her face against his shoulder. "I know." Elias and Jonah became leaders in the growing community. They organized work groups to clear land for gardens, built a shared smokehouse to preserve meat, and trained young men to defend the settlement if danger ever came. They understood that safety might not last forever, that slave catchers could arrive one day, and that Mississippi was only a day's walk away. But for now they had shelter, food, and something they had never truly had before. They had hope. Months passed, winter arrived, and the swamps froze during the nights. The community lived on stored corn, dried fish, and venison from hunting. When spring returned, they planted new gardens and expanded the village. More families arrived. Runaways from Arkansas freed black people from Louisiana, and a few Choctaw families who had been living alone in the wilderness. The settlement continued to grow. Back in Mississippi, among the burned remains of Black River Plantation, the story grew as well. White plantation owners whisper about it, their voices tight with fear. They spoke of the night the enslaved people rose up, the night Samuel Granger was killed, the night everything burned. They hired more overseers, bought more guns, and built higher fences around their slave quarters. They did not speak of it openly, afraid that saying the story out loud would help it spread. But in the slave quarters across Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, the story spread anyway. People shared it in the fields, in kitchens, and in the quiet moments before sleep. They told the story of the 10 girls who were taken and the parents who went to bring them back. They told the story of Gideon Redpath and the hunters who killed the masters. They told the story of the 53 people who walked away from slavery and survived. And within those stories, something changed. Fear became anger. Anger became courage. Courage turned into action. By the time the Civil War began 7 years later, the story of Black River Plantation had become legend. It was told in many ways and with different details, but the heart of the story stayed the same. It was a story of parents who refused to accept the loss of their children, of people who fought back, and of a community that chose freedom over fear. Historians would later argue about whether the story was fully true. Some claimed it was exaggerated, that the numbers were too large, that such an event could not have happened without more records. Others pointed to the burned plantation, the missing people, and the silence of local newspapers. But for those who lived through it, and for the generations who heard the story from their grandparents, the truth was simple. 10 girls were taken. Their parents came for them, and when it was over, 53 people were free. That was enough. Vicksburg was a river town where steamboats stopped and free black families lived in the bottoms near the river, building lives where they could. Gideon had been there before, trading furs and venison for salt and sugar, and now it was their only hope.